Today, we have a classic historical miniature from 1910. Aron Nimzowitsch playing white shows exactly how to punish greed in the opening. The opening is the Spanish game with the Berlin defense and the improved Steinitz setup. White begins with pawn to e4. Black replies with pawn to e5. White develops the knight to f3. Black answers with knight to c6. White plays bishop to b5. Black develops the knight to f6. White castles kingside. Black plays pawn to d6. So far, everything looks normal. Black is solid but a little passive. The king is still in the center, that matters a lot. White now strikes with pawn to d4. This is an important central break. White wants to open the position before black can finish development. Black gets greedy with knight takes e4. This looks like a free pawn, but it is a mistake. The pawn is poisoned. Black wins material for the moment, but ignores king's safety and piece coordination. That changes the evaluation immediately. White now gets the initiative and black's position starts to fall apart. White responds perfectly with pawn to d5. This is the key move. It attacks the knight on c6. More importantly, that knight is pinned by the bishop on b5 because the king is still on e8. The knight cannot move freely. Black tries to break the pin with pawn to a6. White calmly retreats with bishop to d3. This is a very accurate move. The bishop steps away from danger and now attacks the knight on e4. Black retreats with knight to f6. That gives up the extra pawn, but black still has a bigger problem. Knight on c6 is hanging. White takes it with pawn takes c6. And now white is simply a full piece ahead. That is the tactical punishment for the greedy pawn grab. Black now looks for activity and plays pawn to e4. This is a strong practical try. The pawn attacks two pieces at once. It attacks the bishop on d3 and the knight on f3, so black's trying to win material back with a pawn fork. White has a very strong answer. Rook to e1. This is the point. The pawn on e4 is now pinned to the king on e8. It cannot capture yet because moving off the e-file would expose the king to the rook. So black's fork looks dangerous, but it is actually frozen. Black plays pawn to d5. This supports the pawn on e4 and tries to hold the center together. White now plays bishop to e2. This is a quiet move, but it is extremely clever. At first glance, it just looks like a retreat, but it is actually a trap. Why is it a trap? Because now the bishop on e2 is the only piece standing between the rook on e1 and the king on e8. If the bishop moves with check later, the rook will also be unleashed. White is preparing a discovered attack and even a mating net. Black misses the danger and plays pawn takes f3. This is the decisive blunder. Black probably thought they were finally winning back material by taking the knight on f3, but they overlooked the real problem. By moving that pawn away from e4, they open the e-file. Now the king is dangerously exposed. White now plays the brilliant move pawn takes b7. This is a beautiful clearance move. It is completely sound. It is not just a random pawn grab, it does several things at once. First, the pawn reaches the 7th rank and threatens promotion against the rook on a8. Second, it attacks the bishop on c8. But the most important point is this. By moving from c6 to b7, the pawn clears the c6 square. That opens the diagonal, and now white is threatening bishop to b5 checkmate. Black had one defensive chance here. Bishop to e6 was the best move. That move would block the rook on e1 and stop the mating idea. Black would still be worse, but at least the game would continue. Instead, black plays bishop takes b7. This is a very human mistake. Black sees the dangerous pawn, wants to stop promotion, and grabs material. But black completely misses white's real threat. And now the finish is beautiful. Bishop to b5, checkmate. This is a double check. The bishop gives check along the diagonal. And because the bishop moved away from e2, the rook on e1 also gives check along the e-file. That is why the mate is so powerful. In a double check, only a king move can respond. But here, the king has nowhere to go. It cannot escape. It cannot block both checks. And it cannot capture the bishop. Game over. This short masterpiece teaches 3 big lessons. Do not grab pawns in the opening unless you know they are safe. Do not leave your king in the center when the position is opening. And always ask one question before making a move. What is my opponent threatening? In this game, black saw the pawn, but missed the mate.